Welcome to the Ask Sensei Tony podcast, where Sensei will address your questions about life from a cosmic perspective. Please subscribe and ask a question at AskSenseiTony.com to find out more about studying with Sensei privately, becoming a part of our spiritual community, and training to become a mindful minister of oneness in our seminary. We hope you enjoy this episode and find it helpful.
Hi everyone, I'm Sensei Tony, and today's question comes from Scott. Scott says, how do we practice oneness with a loved one who has a different religion from us? Good question. Big subject. And I think because of the nature of the subject, it can't be answered quickly. It has to be something that we'll have to gently kind of wade into. So I think when you are practicing mindfulness, one of the, at least the 4-direction system of mindfulness, you really start to pay attention to the words that you're using and the sentences you're using, the language you're using, because that language, those words are the fingers that shape the mind, just like fingers that shape clay. And so it's really important in mindfulness is to kind of pay attention to our speech. And in the Buddhist tradition, they call this right speech. And one of the presentations of the Buddhist teaching called the Eightfold Path. This path, this marga, this path is made up of different practices of wisdom, meditation, and precept and guidance and action. And so when we are trying to understand something, we have to kind of understand that first. We got to kind of look at that. So when I look at Scott's question, how do we experience oneness with someone who has a different religion from us? So I think we have to define the terms. So oneness, I think, anybody that's a subscriber here has kind of got a pretty good grip on. But oneness is essentially the idea that we are all interconnected. And that interconnection gives us meaning. And that we can both have an existential, which is a humble response to this understanding or knowledge or gnosis. And we can also have a dynamic one, which is the evidence-based one, where we begin to bear witness to what is. And that gives us a different type of strength, because how things work and why things matter are no longer separated from each other, no longer divorced. That's our work, yours, mine, together, as community, as Sangha, the Buddhist term for spiritual friends. So that's what oneness is. So how do I have that? How do I experience that connectedness with someone who practices a religion different from me? So what does the word religion mean? So the word religion is one of those words that may be irredeemable. But I love words, and so I like to look at the origin of words, the etymology of words, and kind of give them a new showing, so that maybe those words can be resurrected and used again. And honestly, I'd kind of left the idea of religion go, because I just figured most people like the word spiritual better, because the word spiritual is kinder and gentler, let's say, or it's something that people relate to as something that's non-dogmatic. But I remember I was in out in Hollywood one time. I think it was Hollywood, and we were at this one indoor mall. It's next to the Lowe's, the Grauman's Chinese Theater, and so forth. And there's a brand called Bad Religion, or True Religion. I'm sorry, not Bad Religion. That's a band. It's called True Religion, and ironically, and they make clothing and stuff. My favorite Buddha, you can see behind me, the big fat one, Hote. Is kind of their logo and symbol. And so I thought, wow, that's kind of cool, what are they saying here? And I don't know, anybody that knows how they came up with that might be able to kind of tell me, but I don't know. there had to be something, some intuition at the very least about that. True religion, and I think he embodies that. But what does the word mean? So the word religion is related to a word, I believe is in Latin, ligar. And it's connected to our word for ligament. And what does a ligament do? A ligament, I believe it connects some muscle to a bone. So it's kind of the very connective thing. And so religion is to connect. And it ultimately can have a very kind of cool, positive meaning. And I don't know, maybe I'll get a sponsorship out of this, but true religion, related to this guy, is the idea that we're connected when we're fully at one with ourselves, which comes from, it starts with a deep sense of acceptance. Remember those commercials for a while where they were saying, this is I think it was for some kind of credit card, but this is this much, this is that much, but, acceptance, priceless. And I think they used from the Flintstones, Fred Flintstone. So there's this sense that acceptance is how we really connect, and that's true religion. So anyhow, that all being said, I think a lot of people, religion has so much baggage that they just don't want to use it, but I'll make my little efforts out there. So what does it mean when someone has a religion different from us? Well, when you understand the word, you can say, it's pretty straightforward, that whatever their religion is, that's what helps them to reconnect. That's what helps them to connect. And when you understand it that way, then you can begin to use the language of oneness to try to kind of see how their religion actually isn't so different from yours. And when you talk about religion and you get into this whole conversation and people start to talk about, which group they belong to. And, my late teacher, Bernie Glassman, used to say that they all can be clubs of oneness, but they're all kind of our club. So if you're a Buddhist, you're in the Buddhist club, Christian club, etc. And you might belong to more than one club. But I think that the key here is to that the club thing. The key to that is not what people might ordinarily think that would separate us. But I think by calling it a club, it kind of defangs it a little bit, and it's just saying that this is how we're coming at this, and this is how we are connected. And these are the traditions and the practices that make us feel connected and help us to experience that oneness, if you will. And these are the practices that help you experience that oneness. But at the end of the day, that's what they're doing. They're helping us connect. And even when you get into a club, clubs can have variations too. I remember the great C.S. Lewis, Jack Lewis, who I loved everything that he wrote. I read everything, including Letters to His Plumber. And he had this metaphor, like I think it was in Mere Christianity, where he talked about, getting into the great mansion. In my father's house, there are many mansions. Or in my father's mansion, there are many rooms. I forget the exact wording. But he had, okay, well, here's the Catholics, here's the Anglicans, here's the Methodists, etc. And so even within a club, you're going to have variations, right? Different teams. and even on the same team, you're going to have variations, because the thing I've found about religion, particularly organized religion, is that it basically is interpreted by the individuals in ways that sometimes don't always fit up with the club credo. So in other words, like, I have known Catholics that secretly believe in reincarnation. I have known Buddhists who have a concept of God. And so you really can't say because you belong to this team that you can know right away what the other person's thinking. You can't. Even if they have a shared credo, they might interpret certain aspects of that credo differently. And I mean, that's incredibly evident within great monolithic religions like Christianity and also Buddhism, etc. So I think that what I'm trying to get at here is that you might be practicing a different from religion from someone else. But you might share some more similar views on subjects than you think. And that just because you belong to a different club, that you might actually have similar opinions. So that's where it all comes down to communication. So I never make an assumption if I meet someone and they're a different religion to me, that they're going to have a different view than me. They might have a different language, they might have a different ritual or way of doing that, but that doesn't mean it's really, in essence, different from the way I'm seeing it. And in fact, my experience in being involved in interfaith, very intentionally engaged in that for the last 30 years, it's more often the case that even if you're a Hindu, or you're a Jew, or you're a Muslim, or you're that as an individual, we may share very similar views. Now, that being said, I think the beauty of the different clubs is that there are different ways to commune. There are different ways to experience communion. That's what I like the word communion for the actual experience of oneness. And, so for a Christian, and as some of you may know, there was a time where I spent time in Christian ministry, and, two things that I learned to love from that was that, the religion of my youth, which was more sort of independent, evangelical, was the word, and preaching, and how powerful that can be. And then when I moved into the Episcopal Church, I really learned to love the Eucharist and the practice of receiving the Eucharist and being a part of serving the Eucharist. As a Buddhist, I have the practice of meditation, particularly meditation that is done from the perspective of abiding, so in the four direction system, in the Dragonfly Sangha, we have two main ways of talking about meditation. One, which is a handmaiden or tool to use to practice mindful inquiry. And the other is to just be, no one special to be, nowhere to go, just be, kind of planting the flag in the ground of my self-worth, my self-acceptance is not predicated by my doing and having. And that's kind of how I interpret the Japanese term shigantaza, which sometimes is translated as just sitting, but I like just being. We call it abiding. And that practice of meditation for me is a deep sense of oneness and communion. That's a ritual for me that is very, so powerful in my life. And I have kind of a romantic feel for it. I look forward to it. I look forward to just being. In that form of meditation, there's nothing you're trying to achieve. You're it. It's kind of the warm, flowering, budding, booting of our realization that we are Buddha nature. And then the other practice, that we have is kodo, or the Japanese kokodo, which is the offering of incense. And for me, I think of incense as an incredibly powerful way to mindfully enter into oneness with the universe. And then the chanting of, sutras, or the chanting of mantras, that for me is another powerful practice. And as some of you may know that are part of the Dragonfly Sangha, our roots are in the Zen and Shin tradition and of Japan. And so the Shin tradition, there is a mantra, if you will, Namu Amida Butsu, called the Nembutsu. And again, one can use that like the first form of meditation as a handmaiden to mindfulness. It's a way of using the breath and using the practice of mantra to, ground oneself. But then there's the other practice of the Nembutsu, which is what's related to the idea of Shinkantaza. And that's coming from what the Japanese call Shinjin, and that's true and trusting. And this is where you say the Nembutsu not out of, anything you're getting from it, but just as the realization of this unfolding, this budding of your true nature. So those are practices of communion that we do in Buddhism, and there's a practice of communion that's done in Christianity. I think hymn singing, choral singing, things like that. That's also another beautiful way. So, we can learn from each other, and there is some evidence that the practice of the Mass influenced the tea ceremony in Japan. And, there's no doubt that the Passover Seder that's practiced on the Sabbath by Jews, that is part of the origin of the Eucharistic practices. And of course, Muslims have the practices of fasting, and they have the practices of praying, certain times of the day, and making pilgrimage. And, there's just so many beautiful ways in which we as human beings can commune, experience oneness. And so, in answer to your question, Scott, it's not really different from you. And you might find that if you start with an attitude of not knowing, that you might find that as you bear witness to the other person's practices, that you actually share a lot of similarities. And where they're different, that's where you can really enjoy and learn from the other. And you can actually integrate the other. And, man, what a beautiful way to practice, right? How cool is that? My teacher, Bernie Glassman, again, he had this vision of what he called houses of one people, hoop, and at, places of worship, centers of spiritual education, would share, these different clubs would share the same space. And boy, I tell you, as organized religion faces its challenges today with a lot of beautiful sacred spaces, being harder to maintain, maybe what Bernie suggested is the answer, that, instead of this big church building, for example, or synagogue, what have you, that's used, once or twice a week, maybe we invite other clubs in and we share that space together, and we learn from each other, and we engage in oneness with the world together. So, I hope you found that helpful, and happy practicing.
You've been listening to Ask Sensei Tony. Please visit our website at AskSenseiTony.com, check out Sensei's books and videos, and become a part of the Dragonfly spiritual lifestyle.